again everyone, and welcome back to Movie Night. Now we'll be talking about the types of comedy, and as I was researching this, I realized that I have made a horrible error because there are a lot of types of comedy. Some of them are a little suspect, but in the spirit of research, I will tell you about all of them, which is going to take a very long time. This is basically the most influential horror movies part 2. Why did I do this to myself? Whatever, let's get into it. So we're starting with alternate comedy, which is basically anything that's not mainstream. I find this to be a little suspect because mainstream is subjective, but whatever, this is the definition. So surrealist, off-color, that's technically alternate. Anecdotal. This is comedy based off past experiences and life stories. Anti-humor. These are jokes that kind of fall flat on the punchline on purpose. Everyone's heard a little bit of anti-humor jokes like, what's brown and sticky? A stick. What's black and white and can't climb trees? A cow. What did Batman say to Robin before they got in the car? Get in the car. Black comedy or dark comedy. This is anything that deals with morbid themes like death or violence. There's also a really great play called Black Comedy by Peter Shaffer, but that's not actually dark humor. That entire play takes place during a blackout. So that is actually a play on words, which we will talk about later. Blue comedy. This is a not very well known one, but blue comedy is comedy based off of vulgar or sexual themes. You probably won't run into this too often because it's based off vulgar things. Character comedy. This is comedy that is based off of stereotypes or stock characters. So things like Commedia dell'arte, which has specific stock characters with each person playing a specific role. That would be an example of character comedy. Cringe comedy. Cringe, the word of the late teens. I think this word has been played out a lot, but in this case it is accurate. It's embarrassment humor, or things that are funny because the characters are put into embarrassing or compromising situations. Deadpan. That is any comedy that is delivered with a straight face and no reaction. So it's not actually a kind of comedy, it's more of a technique of delivery, but it is still used in certain circles. Certain comedians are deadpan comedians, so it's become its own thing. Droll comedy. Now this one's interesting because in English, droll is a synonym for things that are boring or kind of generic, but droll is actually a Dutch word meaning eccentric or capricious. So droll comedy are things that are based off of kind of jokey, eccentric, off-the-wall things. Think like Peeves from Harry Potter. Epigrammatic comedy. This is comedy based off of funny sayings, not exactly wordplay or wit, but funny sayings. Think Ben Franklin's Poor Farmer's Almanac, which is a collection of witty little phrases, kind of like fortune cookies but funny. Farcical. This is comedy based off of improbable situations and people responding weirdly to these situations. Think Marx Brothers. The best example I can think of is the boat scene in Night at the Opera from Marx Brothers, where there's just 20,000 people packed in this really tiny room. It's a great scene, you should look it up, it's amazing. Highbrow comedy. This is comedy based off of fancy topics, and it is really closely aligned with other things like wit. A lot of these themes are really similar to each other. Just wait till we get to parody and satire, they're practically the same thing. Heritage comedy. This is comedy that is based off making fun of your family or your culture. Not exactly the nicest form of comedy, but it kind of fits in that niche of anecdote and self-deprecating. It's kind of in the Venn diagram of that. Hyperbolic comedy. This is comedy based off extravagant or outrageous or over-the-top things. Hyperbole is whenever you just exaggerate something far beyond what it actually is. Saying I kicked a football down the field turns into I punted the winning goal and won the all-state champion. I don't get sports, but you understand what I mean. Improv. Self-explanatory. You're making up something immediately on the spot. You don't have it pre-planned, you're just going. Usually they give you a topic or a theme and you just run with that. It is an exercise in creativity. And improv isn't just comedy. Improv can be any kind of scene that is improvised, just done randomly without a plan in place. But improv is usually very funny because, in my opinion, it's just easier to come off the cuff with a funny thing than a improv drama. Those do happen, but I think the most common form of improv is usually comedy. Inside humor. Again, self-explanatory. They're in-jokes. Insult comedy. Again, self-explanatory, but the difference between insult comedy and, say, self-deprecating humor is you're not making fun of yourself, you're making fun of other people, which is, again, not the nicest thing to do, but it's a form of comedy. Ironic. So ironic comedy is things that are based off irony, incongruities, little sleights of hand, you set up one thing and it turns out to be the other, juxtapositions, yada yada, it's irony. For an example, look at Bo Burnham's song Ironic. Juvenile and sophomoric comedy. Yes, this is actually a term. Juvenile comedy are things made from juvenile jokes, locker room humor. Although that can be somewhat blue comedy, it depends on how childish it is. So there's a lot of overlap. It really just depends on the, I guess, mental age of the joke. Mockumentary, Spinal Tap. All right, moving on. Mordant comedy. This is comedy with a caustic or biting humor. Again, much like wit, and also a bit like insult comedy. If you married highbrow, wit, and insult comedy, you would probably get mordant. Musical comedy. Again, Bo Burnham. This is music that is funny. Starbomb, Ninja Sex Party, Bo Burnham. Also, these are all really great bands you should listen to. Observational comedy. This is very close to satire. Observational comedy makes jokes based off of things that you observe. It's also similar to anecdote, but it doesn't just have to be things that occur to you. It can be just things that you've noticed in society. Most of George Carlin's skits would probably be a mixture of satire, insult, and observational. One-line comedy. It's one-liners. Moving on. Parody. This is comedic imitation. Very similar to satire again, but satire has a specific point that we will talk about when we get to satire. So parody is satire that is a little nicer. It's kind of like mockumentary. Mockumentaries will probably fit in the niche of a parody. Physical comedy. This is a lot of miming or clowning. Think Buster Keaton. It's comedy through exaggerated movements and exaggerated just actions. But it's not exactly slapstick. We will get to slapstick. There is a very big difference between slapstick and physical comedy. Prop comedy. Much like physical, which uses big, over-the-top, exaggerated movements, prop comedy uses big, over-the-top, exaggerated props. There's a wonderful behind the scenes of Criminal Minds where the character Spencer Reid is supposed to be marking a map and he asks for a pen and someone brings on a pen that's about 4 feet long and he does the whole scene with this gigantic pen. That's an example of prop comedy. Satire. So satire is comedy that's aimed at human weakness or societal weakness, like observational, which talks about things that you observe, and parody, which copies things that you observe. Satire is a marriage of these two, but specifically aimed at poking fun at things that are wrong. It imitates the things that are wrong, like a parody does, but parody is just trying to copy. Satire is trying to copy and make fun, mainly to correct the thing that is wrong. SNL is a lot of satire. There's a wonderful SNL skit where a bunch of people are at a dinner party and every time they try to talk about politics or something that's a little intense or opinionated, they all just seize up and just start really being afraid of hurting anyone's feelings. That would be a satire of the way people are afraid to discuss their opinions. Screwball comedy. It's a lot like farcical comedy, but this specifically has weird responses to weird situations. The difference between farce and screwball, because they both deal with people reacting weirdly to weird situations, is that screwball is a little weirder. It has even more over-the-top reactions and even weirder situations. So just like how parody is a little nicer form of satire, and just how physical comedy is a little more highbrow form of slapstick, farce is a higher version of screwball. And I'm saying higher loosely because it's all subjective. When I say it's a higher form of comedy, I just mean that they're trying to play off a little bit more advanced themes than just hitting someone with a bowling pin. Self-deprecating humor. We've talked about this before, but self-deprecating humor is humor where you insult yourself or make fun of yourself. Situational comedy, otherwise known as sitcoms. The Office. Sitcoms take a situation that is either inherently funny or kind of mundane and uses that to showcase funny things. It's a lot like observational, but this is specifically going off the situation, like An Office, or Friends, or any of the other major sitcoms that people grew up on. Sketch comedy. This is live versions of sitcoms that are a lot shorter. You actually have a plan, you go in with maybe some characters or some prop work, but you know what you're doing. It's not like improv, but you are going off of a sketch, a scenario, which is why it's like a sitcom. Spoof. A spoof is basically a combination of parody and mockumentary, and it's one of those categories I'm a little suspect of because there's so many other things that are so similar to it, it maybe might not exist. I would say a good spoof would be Young Frankenstein, because it isn't exactly a mockumentary, you know, a complete, we're doing this for real, but it's just funny, like Spinal Tap, which really went into we are a band, not we're pretending to be a band. It was very all in. But again, Young Frankenstein is a parody of Frankenstein stories. It is self-aware enough to know that it isn't a direct trying to copy and be authentic with that. They know they were making fun of it. Surreal comedy. Anything that deals with absurdism or juxtaposition or just very weird things. Not exactly like Screwball, where it's just weird for weirdness sake. Surreal has a kind of academic look at how it's funny. This also may be a form of comedy that people might not think is funny because it's usually very odd. Surrealist comedy would definitely fall into the alternate comedy spectrum. Slapstick. Three Stooges. So physical comedy we defined as comedy relying on overt exaggeration or physicality. Slapstick is people hitting each other. So it is physical comedy in that you're doing physical things, but it's not supposed to be clowning or miming. It's just watch us all try to shove our butts simultaneously through the store. Stand-up comedy. I disagree with this one. I don't think it's a style, I think it's a person. There are stand-up comics who can do improv or sketch or observational. George Carlin was a stand-up comic. Robin Williams was a stand-up comic. Stephen Colbert used to be a stand-up comic. But this is defined as a kind of comedy, and again, I'm very suspect of it. Topical comedy. This is very close to satire and also very close to observational. Again, it kind of already exists in these other two forms, so it being its own form, I don't buy. Wit or wordplay. Just like highbrow, it's supposed to be very erudite and academic and very cerebral, but mainly with language. It's funny through language. Puns would fall into this category. Epigrammatic would probably fall into this category as well. Oh boy, I know I breezed through that, but that was 39 different kinds of comedy. Even though maybe 7 of those I feel should be cut, but for the sake of explanation, I included them all. I breezed through them because a lot of these are self-explanatory. They're things that we kind of know, even if we can't just say, ah yes, this thing, I know exactly the comedian that best represents this and the work that showcases this form. We all kind of know it. We all know what self-deprecating comedy is. We all know what one-liners and in-jokes are, so I kind of breezed through them so I could focus on the ones that are either very close but with some minor points differentiating them, or the ones that were really weird. I mean, who knows about mordant and epigrammatic? I barely knew about those until I refreshed my memory about them. So next we'll talk about the tropes of comedy, and again there's some overlap, but this isn't just genre or typing, this is more the things that are within comedy that make comedy comedy. When you're watching a comedic movie or a comedic piece, you can point to it and say, ah yes, that's an example of repetition, that's an example of stereotyping, that's an example of hyperbole or juxtaposition. So things like that. We will discuss all of this next week, then after that we will do a case study of a comedic piece and break down its theming, its types, and its devices of comedy. I'm probably going to do Buster Keaton's Sherlock Jr. because I've worked on that piece before, so I have a lot of experience with it. Also, I don't think a lot of people know of it, so it'd be good to kind of highlight that. And secondly, it's really short. I'm fairly sure you can find the whole thing on YouTube, so why not just watch it? But regardless, I will see you on our next movie night.